This is a lesson plan for December 20th on the gospel lesson from Luke chapter 1, verses 39 through 45. The gospel lesson is the final lesson before Christmas Day. It's where Mary goes to meet Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's baby jumps in her womb, and then Mary turns around and sings this song, the Magnificat, right here, which is supposed to be indented like a hymn, but I just broke down the the way it's written out in order to fit it right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how I prepared for the lesson, and then I'll walk through the lesson about specifics about what I put together. So the first thing I did was I read this, and I read it again, and then I opened up my Bible and I read the entire chapter of Luke, chapter 1, and then I opened up another study Bible that I have and I read it again in a different translation. And then after I had read this passage multiple times in multiple translations, then I read the commentary notes in my study Bibles. After I read the commentary notes, then I went through the passage and highlighted the things that finally stood out to me. After I had finished working with the text itself, all primary material except for commentary notes at the bottom, then I went to text week and I read through the contemporary commentaries on it. Everything that stood out to me, I compiled at the bottom in my additional information. It's all cited right there. After that was done, then I looked at the passage in the original Greek and looked into some words that I was interested in, primarily the word for magnifies. After I did that, then I was ready to begin writing my lesson plan. The preparation probably took me 30 to 45 minutes, and then I sat down and wrote the lesson plan in probably 30 to 45 minutes. So what I did after I finished working with the text, then I went to the lectionary page, went to the top of it, and I took the collect of the day, and that's the opening prayer here. Then I wrote some background information, which I felt like was important just for stuff to know before you kind of begin, just to get a sense of perspective. For example, this is the longest birth narrative in the gospel. This is one of the longest chapters in the New Testament. The hymn that Mary sings, called the Magnificat, is one of 4 in the chapter. And then I just have some quick terms here for quick reference for the leaders, what the Annunciation is, what the Incarnation is, and then one helpful note that I found on Text Week was right here to give you a sense of perspective, which I reference. And then if you drop down here to number 7, then you see how it relates. After background information, then go to interpretation. Interpretation, in order to try to just make it accessible to you guys, I broke it down into context, and then to give you some, understanding of the surrounding material, and then I talked about the Magnificat generally and its specific structure, and then more specifically the one word that I want to focus on in my lesson, magnify. For context, I think it's important to be familiar with the Annunciation that happens before the passage, so I told you to be familiar with the Annunciation that happens before the passage. It's a note to the Sunday school leader who's doing this lesson to help them prepare. After that, I talk about Mary's visitation of Elizabeth. Why did they do that? Well, this is a note to help you understand and kind of just guide discussion. They know each other, they're related, they're besties. The Magnificat. Information about it. This is the song that Mary sings in response to the revelation of the Annunciation. The Magnificat comes from the first word in the Latin or the Vulgate translation, magnify, and it follows the traditional form of a song or hymn. Actually, you can specifically locate certain vocabulary and structure to Psalm 103, a common psalm. Bless the Lord, O my soul. The structure of the Magnificat. Verses 46 through 49, the first three, talk about Mary's experience of the blessing of the birth. Mary's talking about things like, my soul magnifies, I'm happy, God's looked favorably upon me, surely people will call me blessed. Okay? The second part of the Magnificat talks about the character of God. There's a shift in focus. If you were studying poetry, this would be considered something of a volta into poetry, and so it's an important observation to make in looking at this piece of this block of material in Scripture as well. So here, what does it say about the character of God? I went through the verses and I located that it said something about mercy, something about strength, something about God's justice, how He provides, how He helps, and how He's faithful. Finally, the major note about theology in the Magnificat that's important to know in interpreting Scripture is the fact that it's characteristic of Luke's attention to the poor. If you wanted to make another title to this lesson, it could be that God lifts up the lowly and lowers the lofty. Finally, this is some important, helpful information as interpreters about the word magnify. This is the Greek word, this is what it means, and this is how often it occurs in the gospel. Once you know this stuff, you're ready to begin application with the Scripture. The application part is pretty much standalone, and that's how it should be. This application section is what the leader has in their hand when they sit down with the kids to go through the discussion of the text. You've begun by looking at the text with the kids. The kids have read it out loud, the kids have thought about it, the kids have prayed, and now you're ready to begin discussing the text specifically with the kids. And so if you've just done that, what's the first thing you want to talk about in application? Well, let's just review a couple things. Application does not need to be very intense or super deep. In fact, these application questions will probably make you wonder about my education, because I'm really not trying to do anything special. The first question actually is to help the kids focus in on the passage and just get basic informational things correct. What child leaps in whose womb? Well, it could be kind of confusing. And you can talk with them about the fact that it's John the Baptist in Elizabeth's womb. Kids are going to be like, is that the same John the Baptist that talks about that eats locusts and wild honey? Yeah, it is the same John the Baptist that we've been talking about for the last couple weeks, Henry. Good job. Okay, and then you make a point of connection. Kids are the minds are starting to work. The gears are starting to roll. The rats are starting to run on the rat wheels. Everybody's starting to get thinking. And you ask another simple introduction question. Why does John the Baptist leap in Elizabeth's womb? Kids are going to look at the passage, and then they're going to give you the superficial answer because he heard the sound of Mary's voice. But why? The question proceeds. And then this is just something you can go with. It's something kind of cool to think about. It's something that you can encourage the kids in their imaginations. But why did he? Well, one possible answer, and I'll just go ahead and tell you this. I wrote this, and it just totally comes from nowhere other than the scary recesses of my little pea brain. Because John the Baptist's mission on the earth is to declare the way for Jesus. His mission, John the Baptist, runs so deep, it's so important that he recognizes the voice of the mother of the person for whose declaration he's been created to make, even while he's still in the womb. There's another interesting observation about this in number 3 point under additional information. If this interests you, you can go check it out. Number 3, what is Mary's response in verse 46 to Elizabeth's reaction? So number 3 gets a little more complicated. The first 2 were gimmes. Now we're just going to ask another face value question about the text that does not require any extra biblical sources to answer. But what is the response? Well, it's praise. She literally sings a song. But then I ask you to do a little bit of work. Why don't you compare this phrase to the angelophany that occurs in chapters 26 through 38? And then I give you the answer, of course, as all good lesson plans should. Even though you should be reading it yourself, and meditating on it. Mary experiences perplexity, pondering, and then finally, the angel often ends with Mary's declaration of obedience. Here I am, a servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your will. Okay? So, when Mary sees the angel, she has this response. But when Mary hears Elizabeth's reaction, she has the response of singing the Magnificat. So why is there the difference? Why does Mary just, she's all weird and perplexed and just says, okay, let it be so, Lord, to the angel, but she doesn't start singing until she goes and talks to her cousin Elizabeth. What's up with that? Well, take a stab at it. Again, this is just my brain, so whatever. You can skip this question if you want. I don't care. To experience an angelic visitation and be blown away with this amazing promise is one thing, but to see the promise brought to its fulfillment in the words of your close family friend is totally different. So Mary's like totally shocked here when she sees the angel, but then this is where it's real. She's actually pregnant. She's shocked in the beginning, but it's given way to an excitement here. And then again, another reference for you if you'd like to look into it. Number 4 is actually kind of interesting. This is something I got off of Text Week, like most of the additional information is. Notice, for instance, the verbs in Mary's song are in the past tense. Mary recognizes as she sings that she has already been drawn into the relationship with the God of Israel. Okay? That's a really cool point to make. If you just meditate on that for a hot second, then I think it opens up a ton of discussion right here with the kids about the fact that Mary responds with praise. Okay? This question is also important because in terms of framing the lesson plan as I wrote it, it's pretty much just like a pivoting point where we started with some face value questions here, and now what I'm trying to do here is to get you thinking and moving into praise. Mary sings a song, we know why, and so now we go deeper into the fact that she sings and to thinking about praise with the kids this morning. So, what does it mean to magnify the Lord? This sounds like a funny phrase, and if you think about it, why would you magnify God if God doesn't need your magnification? And why would you even try it? So it's like, here I'm going to try to put a magnifying glass over God, okay? Thinking about this from the perspective of a kid right here, you can start to stir some discussion up. The verb, though, actually gets at the source of the impulse of praise. It's where you actually rightly attribute greatness to what's great. It's when you recognize how awesome something is that's awesome. It's when the soul recognizes how truly great God is. So, this is the final movement of the key into the lock to open up the hearts. So, final questions 5 and 6 are really open-ended, and they're meant to get the kids talking. This is also the movement in the lesson plan where the Sunday school leader releases control of the group, and kids talking should really begin to just fill most of the time here. And that should be the goal with every lesson plan. So you can see a clear difference in this question from the previous questions. Question 1 is almost a closed question. It's a very straightforward question, and they're very easily answered. Question 2 as well. Question 3 builds. 4 is a little tricky. And then 5 is actually totally open and totally based on experience. Describe a time you felt like you've entered deeply into a state of worship. Okay? All of this is encouraging the kids to think about their experience and context of the scripture that they just read. They're both related to praise. This question is meant to open up their imaginations about how they've experienced God and if it did or didn't map onto the experience that Mary felt. And these supplemental ideas are meant to help you bring conversation along if kids are still thinking. what happens actually in worship? Have you ever felt like you lost yourself? Or have you ever felt a sense of contrast between your smallness and in contrast to God's greatness? Or feel as though praise was being pulled or extracted from you? That's something kind of out of the prayer book. And did you ever feel happily out of control? The sense of comfortable abandonment, if you will. Um, these are really This is a really important question. This is where it finally the rubber meets the road for the discussion. This is a lesson plan about praise, about worship, about magnifying God and going deeper into that. And then the final question is a challenge. That's how I've always written my lesson plans. That's how I think they should all end. But I think it all happens differently. But this is how I personally do it. I think the kids finally need to think about how to cultivate this sense of praise, Mary's sense of magnification into their time during this Christmas season. And how can you do it? I think you should close with prayer requests, offer intercessions for one another, and that's a great way to wrap things up. You can even pray for this posture of praise. The Book of Common Prayers collect for this morning is actually weird. I've given you a note about it right here. Given you a note about Jesus' name and some supplemental information about John the Baptist and additional prayer in the additional information as well. Overall, the lesson plan is prepared for with just meditating first on the text and then on the broader context. And then after you've worked with primary material, I worked with secondary material, which included just commentary notes from a Bible and Text Week and blueletterbible.org. After that, I took the prayer from the collect of the day. I wrote a little background information that just made sense to know in advance. I broke down interpretation in terms of broader context, like I thought was important for us to prepare for. I think we should be prepared to teach the kids this as well. And then interpretation focuses mainly on what I focus mainly on, the Magnificat. This is all supplemental, helpful information for engaging the text and understanding this Magnificat that we're talking about this morning. Finally, the application questions are meant to begin at the surface, get the rat wheels turning, to move into the direction of praise and focus on worship, which is the main focus of the lesson plans for this morning. And finally, to get the kids thinking about their own sense of worship and kind of recultivating a sense of awe for the Christmas season and the birth of Christ.